So one of the aspects of PS5 Pro that I was so curious about was the very short brief sentence on the PlayStation blog on the day they confirmed this console, where they said, and I quote, "Enhanced image quality for PS4 games is also available to improve the resolution on select PS4 games." Now that was a very interesting proposition at the time, given that we have thousands of PS4 games in the back catalog, and they might see retroactive boosts on this console in terms of resolution. That's interesting. Why are you guys not talking more about this or showing it off or saying anything else besides just that? What does select PS4 games mean? And now the console is finally out, so we can test it and see what exactly this feature is doing. And we now also understand the limitations of it as well, because it is a system-wide toggle. So you just turn this on and it's going to stay on up until you turn it off. With that in mind, now testing about, for me, 30 to 35 games, I would say. Something where I actually didn't know this maybe 10 games in, but it's only available during 2160p or 1440p output. That's the first hard limit on when this can be turned on, and the way I found this out was eventually trying PlayStation VR1 titles, because hey, in theory, maybe this thing's also working for PSVR1 games, which would help the clarity on those titles. But when you're using PSVR1 on PlayStation 5, the headset understandably outputs to 1080p, so that's a hard lock right away. So with that restriction in place, we also cannot test or use or try PSVR1 titles. Now, having said that, there is also PS4 Pro enhanced games where we're not entirely sure if that was excluded or not, because in theory, those games can still see some improvements, because not all PS4 Pro enhanced titles are native 4K. If it is native 4K, like I'm showing you here for Luminous Remastered, or I believe A Short Hike is also PS4 Pro full 4K enhanced, there's very few native 4K games on PS4 Pro. So there are still a handful of titles that, in theory, if they're a dynamic res and they have a base resolution that is above 1080, sure, but it still has some kind of reconstruction method that builds it up back to outputting 4K, a near 4K image quality. Perhaps this post-processing filter is also applied on top of that as well, and maybe you can see a slightly more refined image, but the improvement is maybe negligible, given that we really want to focus more on games that are 1080 or lower, and that's where you could actually see those games look a bit sharper. But we still don't know, because Sony has not told us anything. So initially, some of these games I did try out, these very bright, colorful, high contrast games like Luminous or A Short Hike, Everybody's Golf. A lot of these games have 4K image output on PlayStation 4 Pro, and I believe some of them are native as well, so you're not going to see any big difference on these titles. However, I did look at Towerfall Ascension, which is a 1080p, no PS4 Pro enhancement game, and it's very, very minimal. It does appear to be working as far as I can see. You've got to zoom in really far to make it out, but the kind of game where it's really not showing that big of a difference. Now, one title we can say it is working, though, is the PS4 Pro enhanced Knack, the 2013 launch title, which got a PS4 Pro patch well after. I believe it's the same case for Knack 2, but this game does prompt you for one of the earliest options of a fidelity or performance mode. Now, opting for fidelity is not going to have this option on, or rather the system level setting. Opting for performance, though, where the game is then 60 frames per second, and on PlayStation 5 early on through backwards compatibility, it was a very smooth 60 frames per second. You can see the enhancement layer is on. So it is something where just because a game has a PS4 Pro patch, it does not automatically exclude this feature from being turned on. Now, I do also want to thank Digital Foundry here too, because they've had the console earlier, so they were able to get coverage out on this particular feature for PS5 Pro, and they're also more technically inclined, so they have a lot more conviction in these conclusions. But it was something I was suspecting early on before their video came out, which is it some kind of resolution limit, which it does appear to be 1080p. So if anything goes above 1080p, then this feature is not working, which is a little puzzling for when I tried out Tekken 7, because I believe this game is native 1080p on PS4 Pro, and at the time that was the enhancement for that game, which is native 1080 versus the 900 something p that it was running on base PS4 hardware, which was also a distinct possibility for a lot of those PS4 games at the time. So I thought, okay, it should be working for Tekken 7 as well, but it is seemingly not turned on for this game for whatever reason. I'm not entirely sure why. Now, we should also get into some examples here where, based on what we know so far, we know the feature is turned on for these games. but it's probably not doing much of anything because it's directly conflicting with the art style presentation of those games. But a really good example here is Cuphead on PS4, which is a very cartoony game by choice. It has a lot of chromatic aberration, so you've got color bleeding on those black outlines for the characters. You've also got the film grain effect applied to the entire game, which again by choice, and that's meant to really soften the image ever so slightly. And so if it is on, it's not really doing much of anything, which is actually a good thing given that you don't want it to make the game look worse. I wouldn't even be surprised if there is maybe some sort of behind the scenes like unknown whitelist and blacklist where that can also remove certain games from this feature being active. So even though on a system level you can turn this on, there are certain parameters that will exclude those games from actually having this feature being utilized. One thing being a resolution above 1080p, but another possibly being examples like this. Another game that I really wanted to try out here was The Order 1886, a game so well known at the time for the heavy use of film grain, the cinematic feel with the black bars, all very contentious things at the time. You can see from these screens, there is just no difference. You would probably have to sit very close to your display, and a very large display at that, to make out any sort of meaningful difference. Look how far I have to zoom in to the intricate etched details on this gun for you to see that the filter is doing something to this game. It is slightly refining the image and the details of this gun, but you don't really want that for this game anyway, and you're not going to notice it in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Same for the 2015 Need for Speed, which I decided to check out. This game, too, is very odd in that you've got the film grain effect, but it is also primarily played at night. The game never has any sort of day cycle happening, so it's a lot of low light conditions as well, which means you're not really given many opportunities for like high contrast scenarios where the filter is going to be a lot more pronounced. And so while it does have an effect in certain cases where you zoom in very close, you're just not really going to notice it. Now, Need for Speed, also a game where the 2015 one is problematic on PlayStation 5 when played through backwards compatibility. It does have the warning prompt. It's part of those 100-something games. I wanted to see if these games were blacklisted from the enhancement being turned on. Not only is it there for Need for Speed, I also tried Super Stardust Ultra, and this game too has the filter turned on to a point where you can make it out more clearly. At least with this game, I could notice it while playing based on the ship detail, the triangle pattern around the planet. It was something that I could see while playing versus, say, a game like Need for Speed. But while we're talking about two games that are broken on PlayStation 5 through backwards compatibility, we should also mention what was pointed out in the Digital Foundry video, which was one of their community members pointed out, hey, Just Cause 3 is broken when this feature is turned on. And sure enough, it is. A lot of the geometry just goes flickering, or it goes on and off while you're moving around. It's based on player position. It's not a backwards compatibility issue, it's just being introduced based on this new feature. So thankfully it's something you can turn off on the fly, but this is the only game that we've seen so far. After seeing this, I tried like 20 more games. I still couldn't run into any other examples. Of course, the PS4 library is massive, so it could be one of the only games that does this, but just something to bear in mind as you play some of your older PlayStation 4 software. Now, something else I was very curious about was the classic games on PS4 and PS5. All the PS1, 2, PSP stuff, could we maybe clean those games up even more if we purposefully download the PS4 version on our PS5 Pro and get access to the enhancement? And the short answer here is no. The reason being, for PS1, we are locked out because PS1 games output just above 1080p on both PS5 and PS4 Pro. It's like 1920 by 1440 or something. So just by that merit alone, we're locked out. PS5 games will, or the PS5 console will always choose the PS4 Pro enhancement of a PS4 game. So we're always locked out of that. For PSP games, though, a lot of potential upside here because a lot of the UI elements and flat images and just that stuff is all blown up and then filtered, and it still looks kind of ugly for most cases. But with PSP games, they're 1080p. The filter should be on, like the image enhancement tool that Sony has here, but for whatever reason, it is not on, so it looks the exact same on the native PS5 version and also the PS4 one with the enhancement toggled on or off. And this is also true for the PS2 emulation as well, the new updated emulator where that I believe is displaying those games above 1080p on PS5 and PS4 Pro. If not, I'm at this point inclined to say that even if it is, say, native 1080p, so it should be within that criteria, they're probably blacklisting their emulation titles, not just from the new program, but also the old program as well, because these titles, many of them were under 1080p and then upscaled from there, so in theory, they should still meet the criteria for the enhancement being turned on, but games like Jak 2 or GTA San Andreas, no enhancement, no difference. They look the exact same. They are completely identical. So I am inclined to say that if there was a blacklist where certain titles are turned off, it's probably these ones that are included. Now, I did still want to look at games outside of Sony's emulation efforts, and so one example here is Final Fantasy VII, the PC port from 2015, which, of course, it's a PS1 game originally, and so here we can see that for the FMVs or the pre-rendered backgrounds, not really doing a whole lot, but if you have any character models on screen where that's very high contrast, so you've got either in the overworld or during combat, that's where you can see a noticeable difference where the sharpening is taking place on Cloud's character model. Which we can now move on to the better examples here, things that are going to be a lot more noticeable when you're actually playing the game. The big one is going to be UI elements, text on screen, anything that's static, not moving, the HUD as well. These things are going to stick out, and it was the one thing generally across all games where it's going to be very noticeable. If you're not seeing improved image quality in the actual gameplay, it's almost always going to be at least text and sharp lines that see that refinement. We can also get into examples of games that are more conducive to these improvements, unlike a Cuphead or the Order 1886, which falls back on the inherent design and art direction of that game. Something like Gravity Rush or Katamari Damacy looks really nice with the enhancement filter turned on. It really is the art direction that can at times be very complementary with this post-processing filter that we assume might be machine learning based in nature, which is also a very 0.5 or 1.0 version of what we're seeing right now on PlayStation 5 Pro, and perhaps also illustrates why Sony did not spend too much time talking about it. But you can see in some cases where a game is, maybe cel shaded, graphic art style, comic book style, just high contrast art, you're seeing a pretty big difference. Games like Octodad or Katamari, I was really surprised to see them upon boot up because they arguably do look like they're really running at a higher resolution than 1080p when they were left untouched on PlayStation 4 without even so much as seeing a Pro enhancement as well. Then we move on to the higher end stuff on PS4, AAA, early life cycle. Many of these games were 900p to 1080p, and so there is some room for improvement here if the scaler is looking to not quite bring them up to 4K image quality, but something that's a little bit in the middle. And so you are seeing that for some of these titles. One good example here is Drive Club, where many consider it a crime this game never got a PS4 Pro enhancement, and you do have that here finally. It's not quite 4K, but it does appear to be noticeably better with improved image quality and sharpening applied to the car models and the environment as well. And it's not just tangible in this comparison, you can see it in the moment-to-moment gameplay. Other games, it's less so. That depends on what kind of anti-aliasing they were using and how aggressive it was and what kind of results we were seeing at the time. Killzone Shadowfall is one that's always looked very good relative to other PS4 launch titles, but here, all these years later, the anti-aliasing that Guerrilla settled on at the time is not really helping resolve a cleaner image quality with this new enhancement layer that is available on PlayStation 5 Pro. So I think it makes a lot more sense now as to why Sony didn't really say much about this or even show it off, because if they show one or two really good examples, then that's not really going to be indicative or representative of what people are going to play for their own titles, which in some cases you might not have anything that really looks all that good or improved. But it does show promise. Some games, it was not a game-changing feature, but I would rather play Drive Club with that setting turned on than not. Right? So for some games, it does look a lot better. And I would love to see this get to a point where it's a lot more non-discrete and it really doesn't matter what the game looks like or what it was doing at the time for film grain, chromatic aberration, anti-aliasing, any sort of techniques that the studio employed at the time to try and get a nicer image quality, but ultimately it doesn't hold up in the here and now. I would love to see this software refined to where it really ignores all those things and can figure out what kind of image it's supposed to spit out for a near 4K image quality. And it's great knowing that on PlayStation 5 Pro and going into the next hardware cycle, we've got not just PSSR, but also this little experimental layer that Sony is now working on as well. So if anything, I think it still bodes well for the future if they do work and refine on it, which I would love to see, because these games are completely untouched, going back to 2013 to 15, 16 on PlayStation 4. That's still hundreds of games that in theory could see some meaningful improvements without touching the base code, because they can't, right? So there's some benefit there. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you all in my next one. You take it easy.